of Vikings, and that's appropriate. Iceland will become a Viking country, but at first, Iceland seems to have been settled by not the Vikings, but the Irish monks in particular. So if you were a monk in Egypt or in Syria, you could go off into the desert seeking isolation, but if you're in Ireland, not too many deserts, so you go look for what they call the desert in the sea. You make a wicker boat, and you just head off and go wherever the Lord sends you, and some of these will land in Iceland. By the way, there are stories, who knows if they're true, there are some who believe that some of these Irish monks end up in North America as the first Europeans in North America, but we do know, though, that some of them will end up in Iceland, and when the first Vikings show up, they find Irish monks in Iceland. These guys will get written out of the sagas, or they'll get pushed out, but the fact remains that some of the first settlers in Iceland, the first perhaps, were Irish monks. The Vikings won't show up here in force until the late 800s. Really, there's a 60-year window there from about 870 to 930 where there's a major Viking land grab in Iceland. That 60-year period where all the best spots are taken by the Vikings who show up. And by the way, among the Vikings who show up during this first little bit here are Irish as well. Not monks this time, but captives, slaves, concubines. See, that's one of the things the Vikings did, is they kidnapped a lot of people. Vikings were mostly young men. I mean, Viking means pirate. These guys were, for whatever reason, they were pushed out of Scandinavia, land scarcity, whatever it might be. They're looking for brides, they're looking for land and opportunity elsewhere. And as we know, they're going to show up all over the place. Europe and the edges of Asia, all over Northern Europe and the Baltic, all over the Atlantic coast, Spain. They're going to set up shop and set up a whole kingdom in southern Italy, North Africa, Constantinople, the Black Sea, and beyond, Russia. I mean, they're all over the place. And this is what they're looking for. So when they first show up in Iceland here, they have a bunch of these captives with them. They have a bunch of these Irish with them. Well, you have that 60-year period when all the best sites are taken, and then anyone who shows up afterwards is sort of out of luck. You got to take subpar land, or you keep pushing west. Now, if you're a American student or a Western student, you've probably heard of Erik the Red. You've probably heard of Leif Erikson. These are names that may sound familiar in the context of the discovery of America for Europe and things like that. Well, as you dig into these people and put context behind them, you find they're probably a lot more interesting. So Erik the Red, for example. Erik the Red's father was a Norwegian Viking who becomes a fugitive. All we know is that he was a murderer, or there were several killings done at his hands, or at least alleged to have been done at his hands. So he has to flee Norway. Where does he flee? Right here. He flees to Iceland and sets up shop here. His son, probably a little bit like him, he ends up getting banished from Iceland for 3 years for murder. Several killings done at his hands. And where does he go for those 3 years of banishment? Well, he pushes west, looking for better land. This is what Vikings do. And he heads west, and he heads to a place he calls Greenland. And he sets up a colony of several hundred there, and he becomes the chief colonizer of Greenland. It just so happens that a merchant, a trader named Bjarni Herjolfsson, looking to trade with this new colony of Greenland, he sails towards Greenland, but his boat, his ship, overshoots Greenland, and instead he lays eyes on what we now call North America, Bjarni Herjolfsson. He does end up in Greenland, and who ends up buying his ship years later, many years later? Erik the Red's son, Leif Erikson, ends up buying Bjarni Herjolfsson's ship, the same ship. And it's Leif Erikson that ends up making landfall in North America in a place called Vinland. We don't know where Vinland is, where Leif Erikson's campsite was, though a campsite has been found. A Viking campsite, we don't know if it's his. But Vinland could have been, I've read scholarship that places it on Prince Edward Island, Nova Scotia, New England, even as far south as Virginia, who knows. But in any case, he's there for a couple winters, I think. Ends up having to leave, mostly due to encounters with what the Vikings, or who the Vikings call Skraelings, the locals, the Native Americans, the American Indians. These are violent encounters. Sometimes the Vikings kill the Skraelings, sometimes the Skraelings kill the Vikings, but be that as it may, it is not profitable for Leif Erikson to be there any longer, and he ends up leaving. Erik the Red's family, Leif Erikson's family, they will continue to settle, or try to settle, North America, and most of this doesn't make it into the textbooks. Leif Erikson's brother will try to settle in America. Leif Erikson's brother-in-law will try to settle in Vinland, in this land. Erik the Red's illegitimate daughter will try to settle here. All will fail, mostly because of contact with the Skraelings, which turns violent in nature. I'm in Alexandria, Minnesota, where the famous Kensington runestone is housed in a runestone museum. Kensington is a village not far from here. If authentic, the Kensington runestone would prove that there was a Viking presence in the interior of North America, at least in the 1360s. The Kensington runestone purports to be from the 1360s. Kensington runestone is by no means the only runestone, or purported runestone, to be found in North America. And there are other artifacts too, iron artifacts, battle axe heads, other things that have been found that at least suggest that the Vikings were much more involved, at least as travelers and explorers in North America, than Leif Erikson and his family's attempts to settle one campsite in Vinland. Is the Kensington runestone authentic? Well, do some research, you be the judge. It's interesting though, we give Columbus credit for discovering America, and for Europe at least, for the old world, and rightly so. He is a pivot, everything changes after Columbus, but would he have made the voyage without the Vikings, without Erik the Red, without Leif Erikson, without Bjarni Herjolfsson? Without these guys, would Christopher Columbus have made the voyage? They wrote down their experiences in their sagas, and Columbus, we know, studied these sagas and helped. It was one of the things that helped convince him that you could sail west to reach Asia, that there is land there to be discovered, to be found. You can go that way. So the Vikings definitely need to be remembered for that reason. One more interesting note: Columbus sails in 1492. The Vikings from Greenland continue to collect timber in North America into the mid-1300s. So barely 150 years before Columbus changes everything, the Vikings are probably still using North America, visiting North America, cutting down trees in North America, all the way up to that point. It was sort of an interesting little tidbit. Who discovered America? Who knows? In fact, there are some scholars who believe that it wasn't the Vikings or Columbus, but in terms of discovering America for Europe, it was Irish monks. Irish monks on their wicker boats, sort of crash landing into North America. You be the judge.